The prison doors do not slam shut, they open, and no one is locked inside. Not because crime has disappeared, but because punishment itself has been replaced. Every sentence, every conviction, every act of violence, fraud, or harm is no longer answered with confinement, but with one mandate. Empathy training. Mandatory. Global. Inescapable. The moment the policy is announced, the world reacts with disbelief. For centuries, justice systems have relied on incarceration, isolation, deterrence through fear, loss of freedom as consequence. Now, in a single legal shift, humanity chooses a radically different path, not retribution, but psychological reconstruction. The idea is grounded in real science. Empathy is not purely moral, it is neurological. It involves mirror neuron systems, emotional processing networks, cognitive perspective-taking mechanisms. Research has shown that empathy can be strengthened through structured training, therapy, and behavioral conditioning, which raises a profound question. If criminal behavior often stems from emotional detachment, trauma, or impaired social cognition, what happens if the response is not punishment, but enforced emotional awareness? The first phase begins immediately. Courts still operate, trials still occur, evidence is still examined, guilt is still determined. But sentencing changes completely. Instead of years behind bars, offenders are enrolled in intensive empathy rehabilitation programs, neurological assessments, psychological profiling, immersive perspective simulations, victim impact cognition training. The shift is not symbolic, it is systemic. Minutes after sentencing reforms take effect, prison intake systems collapse. Correctional facilities begin transforming into rehabilitation centers. Cells are redesigned into monitored therapeutic environments. Security remains. But the objective changes. It's not containment. Transformation. Hours later, global governments face a logistical reality. Prisons house millions of individuals worldwide. Replacing incarceration requires massive psychological infrastructure. Therapists, neuroscientists, behavioral specialists, TEA, emotional training systems. Society must invest not only in justice, but in human behavioral reconstruction. Days pass, public opinion fractures. While some see the reform as dangerously lenient, others see it as evolution. A justice system focused on prevention of future harm rather than punishment of past actions. Historically, rehabilitation models have existed in limited forms. Certain justice systems have experimented with restorative justice, therapeutic sentencing, behavioral correction programs, but never on a global mandatory scale. The timeline accelerates. Weeks into implementation, early psychological data begins emerging. Offenders exposed to immersive empathy training show measurable neurological changes. Increased emotional recognition, reduced impulsive aggression, improved cognitive control in social conflict scenarios. However, the escalation phase reveals complications. Not all crimes stem from lack of empathy. Some originate from ideology, desperation, psychopathy, or calculated rational decision-making. This forces researchers to adapt training protocols. Standard empathy modules evolve into specialized psychological interventions. Trauma therapy for violent offenders, moral reasoning development for white-collar criminals, impulse regulation for repeat offenders. Months later, the global domino effect becomes visible. Prison populations decline dramatically. Government budgets previously allocated to incarceration infrastructure shift toward mental health systems. Urban crime patterns begin changing, not disappearing, but transforming. Repeat offenses decrease in regions with advanced rehabilitation frameworks. Yet skepticism remains strong, because society has always equated punishment with justice. Removing punishment challenges deep cultural instincts about accountability. Years pass. A new generation grows up under a justice system focused on emotional responsibility rather than fear-based deterrence. Educational systems integrate empathy training at early developmental stages. Conflict resolution becomes a core academic discipline. Neuroscience becomes central to legal reform. But the long-term psychological effects reveal a deeper transformation. Offenders undergoing mandatory empathy immersion are required to experience simulated reconstructions of their actions' consequences, not as punishment, but as cognitive exposure. They witness the emotional aftermath of their actions from the victim's perspective through advanced psychological simulation. This produces a powerful internal response, not fear of authority, but confrontation with impact. Scientific comparisons with traditional incarceration reveal unexpected trends. Prisons historically reduce freedom, but they do not always reform cognition. Isolation can sometimes reinforce resentment, aggression, and antisocial identity. Empathy training, by contrast, targets the neurological roots of harmful behavior. Yet a dark realization begins to emerge over decades. Empathy can be trained, but it cannot be forced to be genuine in every individual. Some offenders learn to perform empathy, to mimic emotional understanding. Without internalizing moral change, this creates a new challenge for justice systems. Distinguishing authentic rehabilitation from adaptive compliance. Meanwhile, societal psychology shifts significantly. The public perception of crime evolves. Instead of asking how long should they be punished, the dominant question becomes, have they cognitively changed? Technology advances to support this model. Neuroimaging tools monitor emotional response patterns. AI-assisted therapy tracks behavioral progress over time. Longitudinal data replaces fixed sentencing durations. Release is no longer based on time served, but on demonstrated psychological transformation. Decades later, the global environment reflects subtle but profound changes. Violent crime rates decline gradually in many regions, not because humans become inherently peaceful, but because early intervention systems identify emotional risk factors before escalation. Justice becomes predictive rather than reactive. However, the unexpected consequence surfaces in ethical debates. Is enforced empathy training a form of psychological coercion? If the state mandates emotional restructuring, where is the boundary between rehabilitation and control? This question reshapes legal philosophy worldwide, because unlike prison, empathy training enters the mind itself. It does not just restrict movement, it attempts to reshape perception. Centuries into such a system, historians would likely describe this era as the turning point where justice shifted from physical punishment to cognitive reform. A civilization that concluded that preventing harm requires understanding human psychology more deeply than punishing human behavior. Yet the final paradox remains unresolved. True empathy cannot be measured perfectly. It can be observed, encouraged, strengthened, but never guaranteed. Some individuals may genuinely transform, others may adapt behavior without internal change. And still, society must decide whether reduced harm is sufficient justification for psychological intervention. In the end, the world without prisons would not necessarily be a world without consequences. It would be a world where consequences occur internally rather than physically, where accountability is experienced emotionally instead of spatially, where justice is defined not by suffering endured, but by awareness gained. And as humanity stands in such a system, one quiet and unsettling question would remain. If we can train empathy in those who cause harm, could the same system one day be used to reshape the thoughts of anyone society deems dangerous?